Hello there. I haven't done one of these video podcasts in a while, but I was just compelled because I watched a very recent video a couple days ago by Lecrae discussing his journey in Reformed theology of a certain kind, particularly the influence that he had on John Piper. And I can tell you this, based on the corpus of Reformed theology that Lecrae and those in the 116 Clique were given, what happened to Lecrae was entirely predictable. I could have predicted this years ago, and namely because of this. The type of Reformed theology, a very narrow version of it that he was given by John Piper and that entire world, can't do social questions. There's no social ethics. And so, given what he said in the video, it made complete sense to me. And I'm really heartbroken because I think the Reformed evangelical community, or rather I should say the Calvinist evangelical community, really missed an opportunity to do something fantastic with an entire group of emerging leaders because they gave them a framework that was incredibly insufficient for dealing with the kind of issues that black Christians have to think about. We not only think about issues of personal piety, but in the black church tradition and the black theological tradition, we also have to think about Christian social thought. And one of the things you do not get from the Puritans is Christian social thought. You cannot go directly from doctrine to dealing with social questions. That's not how Christian ethics works. And sadly, given what the toolbox that Lecrae and others were given, it was entirely predictable to me that as soon as there was a major social event, that they were going to be completely incapable of tying theology directly to those issues because that's not what they were given. So what I do want to do in this video is explain, in part, why Lecrae's journey out of Reformed evangelicalism, or rather, as I said, Calvinist evangelicalism, ended like it did. And it's really sad that it came to pass that way. I just want to just review a few things. I'll link the video that he posted on YouTube for you to review yourself. It's about 50 minutes long, and it's a pretty vulnerable, really honest description of his journey. And I really appreciate the fact that he was able to put that out and felt comfortable doing that. I think the timing was right. He sort of tells his story of discovering Reformed theology through campus outreach and through reading books by John Piper, being very heavily influenced by the Desiring God world. And it really, to me, makes sense that that sort of formation would not provide the categories that Lecrae and others needed to do the sort of connecting the dots with theology and doctrine and social ethics, social thought issues. It all sort of came down when there were a number, you may remember 10 years ago or so, there were a number of unarmed black men who were experiencing police shootings. And there was a massive discussion in the country about that. And this is when Lecrae and others were trying to figure this out theologically. And as he was discussing the injustice that was presented in some of those cases, he was called liberal, he was called woke, he was called all of these names that really I thought were completely wrong and inappropriate. The brother was just trying to figure out how does all this doctrine apply to these issues, and he, rightly so, like a lot of us, were disturbed by some of the footage of some of the shootings that we saw, and it just raised a new set of questions. And unfortunately, Puritan sort of doctrine can't answer the sort of questions that are raised when you see police activity, particularly with unarmed men, criminal justice reform issues, and things like that. So to me, it makes complete sense. But I was really, really saddened to hear that. And I think several years ago there was kind of a public announcement that Lecrae made, that he was moving on from evangelicalism in the first place. And I think it just completely makes sense, because, as I said a few moments ago, you cannot get from soteriology and the doctrine of salvation and the 5 points of Calvinism, you cannot go from that to talking about social issues. And sadly, the toolbox that he was given at the time, which I thought was utterly insufficient, and some would even say pathetic, was this weird category that dealing with social issues and social questions was not the gospel itself. It was an implication of the gospel, which I think is just an utterly ridiculous category to introduce to young men who are thinking about the connection between doctrine and life. Thinking about issues of human flourishing, issues of social justice, even if you want to use that term, issues of human dignity are not implications of the gospel unless your definition of the gospel is really narrow. And that's exactly what Lecrae and others got in that world. They got an extremely narrow, individualistic understanding of the gospel. It was this idea, of course, that grace saves, that you're saved by grace, not by works, which I completely agree with and understand why that was such an emphasis. It was in response to a lot of dispensational and Arminian theology. So that whole movement really was addressing a real question. But I really wish that instead of being introduced to that really small soteriological focused version of Calvinism, that he had gotten a more robust version, often called neo-Calvinism, that focuses on the categories of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. That personally is my own background in terms of my interest in Reformed theology. So there's a book that came out probably 20 years ago, edited by Anthony Carter, that was called Glory Road. And in that particular book, there were, I believe, 10 stories of African Americans who had discovered Reformed theology. And if I remember correctly, I was the only one in the book who told a story of being drawn into Reformed theology, not because of the 5 points of Calvinism, but mainly because of covenant theology and the creation, fall, redemption, restoration narrative. Now, creation, fall, redemption, restoration includes this emphasis that we are saved by grace. It includes the solas, but it is much more robust and I would say profound in terms of its orientation, that can be helpful in applying doctrine to society and doctrine to life. And some key figures in that tradition, of course, would be Herman Bavinck, Abraham Kuyper, Louis Berkhoff, all of these sort of Dutch theologians. Francis Schaeffer, I think, would be a modern application of someone who sort of came out of that tradition. And that's sort of the context in which I cut my own teeth in Reformed theology. It was not this pietistic form or this revivalistic form that really focuses and narrows Reformed theology on the sovereignty of God with respect to salvation, or focusing on the 5 points of Calvinism or the solas, etc. And it's just really unfortunate that that particular brand is something that captured so many of those young men and women in that movement in the early days. And I wonder what would have happened if, instead of Lecrae and others being connected to John Piper, that instead they were connected to Vincent Bacote at Wheaton, who is a fellow, I believe, still at the Center for Public Justice. And Dr. Bacote's framework that he works out of is creation, fall, redemption. And as an African-American theologian at Wheaton, that's been so key in the work that he's done in his entire career, connecting Reformed theology to social questions. And that is a major, major deficiency, I think, in so much of the toolbox that these young lads were given in the early days. One of the things that Lecrae did talk about, which I thought was really interesting, is that he sort of got caught up in this movement where he got enamored by some of these big names like John Piper, really was drawn in because of their platform. And this is part of the problem in terms of what happened historically over the last 20 years, is that a lot of those leaders who had platforms lacked the humility, I think, to send them to some more mature, seasoned black theologians and pastors in the Reformed tradition. They believe, because of their own limitations, that the only thing that black communities need is just good doctrine, as if doctrine alone is going to help connect the dots to life. And of course, this is part of the limitations of having a theology that's, number one, not grounded in a confession or a tradition with a confession, and instead is grounded in personalities. I wonder what would have happened if Lecrae and the 116 Clique had been grounded in the three forms of unity, for example, instead of John Piper. Would have happened if they had been grounded in the Westminster Confession of Faith instead of John Piper or Desiring God, which is completely personality driven. And so what that means is that your entire theological framework is limited by the limitations of a person, as opposed to getting a robust, more broad understanding of what doctrine is by looking at a document that has been tested and tried and applied for 500 years. Instead, you get attached to an individual who has an incredible platform. And I get it. I got caught up into that stuff as well. I'll link a video of a chapel message that I gave at Wheaton College many, many years ago now, where I sort of explained my own journey with sort of being platformed and getting connected to some of these names, Josh Harris and Mark Driscoll and Tim Keller and Ed Stetzer and Eric Mason. And there's a whole list of people that I was also involved with in terms of publicly advancing Reformed theology, which I love, which I think is really, really fantastic. But I just wonder what would have happened if they had been given a framework of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, as opposed to getting a framework that was limited to pietism and revivalism, and this ridiculous idea that addressing issues in society and culture and justice are implications of the gospel and aren't really central to God's redemptive mission in the world to redeem all things and to call the entire creation back to himself, which is something that you would get from the neo-Calvinist tradition, is something that a theologian like Vincent Bacote at Wheaton would have really been absolutely vital to helping them connect those dots. And it's just sad that it turned out the way it did. I'll just give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. So I'm currently writing a book on poverty, and I'm looking at the causes of poverty. It will be a reformed reflection on poverty. And here's what I'm using. I'm using the work of Herman Bavinck. Now, in fairness, this wasn't out when Lecrae and others were dealing with a lot of the social issues that were more prevalent in the country regarding some of the police shootings. So this wasn't out. So in fairness, this would not have been an available resource. But I'm using Herman Bavinck. I am also using more Herman Bavinck. So that was a book on social ethics. This is his book on reformed ethics in general, which is more sort of personal ethics in that sense. and I'm also using the work of Reinhold Niebuhr, this book, The Nature and Destiny of Man, which is absolutely fantastic in terms of dealing with some of these issues. But the key text for me that I've been using my entire career, that I have been not just using but applying, it's kind of the theological DNA of the work that I do, is this book by Gerard Van Groningen, From Creation to Consummation. And in that book, you get the categories. You get the categories from Gerard Van Groningen that would have been immensely helpful in trying to connect the dots between doctrine and society. There is so much good content in this book by Gerard Van Groningen. I don't have time. I could spend several hours talking about what's so good about this book. But I think it provides some categories and some opportunities to think more broadly about the relationship between doctrine and life and doctrine and society that would have been immensely helpful. You know, we often hear in people who piecemeal and cherry pick the Reformed tradition about the cultural mandate. And this mandate often described to dismantle the distinction between the sacred and the secular, which we got from a lot of fundamentalism. So one of the things that we get from Gerard Van Groningen, which is so key in the actual Reformed tradition, which has been cherry-picked by some of the more pietistic and revivalist types, is this emphasis on the cultural mandate. And the cultural mandate, as Van Groningen describes it, is that the man and the woman were to exercise their royal prerogatives by ruling, developing, and simultaneously maintaining the cosmos. All forms of life on the earth were specifically placed under human vicegerents and their oversight. With responsibility came the privilege to use plants and their fruit and their seed for sustaining life and energy to perform their royal duties. Humanity could respond to the cultural mandate obediently to God's glory because their creation in the image and likeness of God. And because of this, Van Groningen continues, God, by enunciating this mandate, placed mankind in a unique relationship with the entire creation, with the entire cosmos. In a real sense, it was a relationship to rule over the cosmic domain, but that rulership involved work. Labor is therefore a royal privilege as well as a responsibility. So this cultural mandate is this broad sense that humans made in God's image and covenant relationship with God were given the responsibility to rule and subdue and govern and maintain the entire creation. That includes people, places, and things, not just saving people from hell or simply the gospel of personal salvation, a personal relationship with God. It's more than that. It is this idea, of course, that God is redeeming all things, that Christ has come to call all things back to himself, as it says in Colossians. The Greek word is ta panta, all things. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the cultural mandate is not the only mandate that we understand and learn from the Reformed tradition. There's also the social mandate. And the social mandate is so much of where we get our emphasis on social ethics. The social mandate, as Van Groningen describes it, is this idea that God created humanity in his image and his likeness, and that male and female were to carry out their ordained God-given rules for creating institutions like marriage and family and society. that there is this social mandate that also emphasizes the relationships between people. And lastly, there's a third mandate that Van Groningen articulates, which is the fellowship mandate. This is really the relationship between God and humanity. This mandate that those who are made in God's image are to be in right relationship with God. So we got the cultural mandate, we've got the social mandate, and the fellowship mandate. And one of the things that you're not going to get from John Piper's world is an explication of doctrine that expands on all three of these mandates that work in harmony to explain that God is redeeming all things. The entire creation is a part of God's desire for Christ's work to be applied here and now. When we talk about Christ's work accomplished and applied, it's not just applied to people, it's applied to the entire creation. And that includes issues like poverty. That includes issues of injustice. That includes issues of criminal justice reform. That includes sex slavery. It includes child trafficking. It includes a whole host of issues, because all of those issues are in the creation, and the creation is being redeemed by the work of Christ and his church. This is what God's people are doing. God is using them as his agents, as Van Groningen says, vicegerents, to be not just simply partners, but the hands and feet on the ground right now, pushing the parasite kingdom back. What Van Groningen describes as the parasite kingdom is the work of the devil, the work of the enemy, to destroy God's goodness everywhere. And this is something that you get in the black church tradition. You get an emphasis on, of course, personal piety, but there's also an emphasis that God is going to use his people to fight back and push back against the devil himself. And not just how the devil works in your personal sin, which is not something we should ignore, but how the devil is working in society and culture and the world to destroy it. The prince of the air, as the Bible talks about it. And I just so wish that Lecrae and the 116 Clique, that whole crew, had been introduced to this framework first, instead of getting the stuff that they got with John Piper that just reduced what their understanding of Reformed theology to really just the issues of salvation and maybe a little light on providence, but there wasn't really much on justice. There wasn't really much on human flourishing, and sadly, when the rubber met the pothole in some major events in the culture, they were flat-footed. And so this is what happens. I think in so much of Calvinistic evangelicalism, because it's such a narrow emphasis on individual salvation, that when it comes to social issues, they just revert back to secular politics and secular political theory, because they don't have the categories to connect the dots between doctrine and culture. So this is why you get the sort of standard, I'm Reformed and a Republican, right? I'm Reformed and I pledge allegiance to a particular political ideology. And David Koyzis, in his book, Political Vision and Illusions, really makes the case that is just complete anathema. That is the road to idolatry. That is the road to syncretism. And that's a road that actually can eventually destroy your faith when you don't have a category for Christian social thought. And the entire Desiring God world, the whole John Piper world, has nothing to offer for a Christian social thought. I am convinced, and I'm going on record saying this, that the absolute worst way to introduce Reformed theology to anyone who is African American or Hispanic is to give them a bunch of doctrine that's narrowly applied to personal salvation and to leave it at that without expanding the scope of what it means to be in union with Christ in a covenant theology framework that includes the cultural mandate, the social mandate, and the fellowship mandate. It's got to have all three of those if it's really going to be a robust, actual reformed understanding of what Christ came to accomplish in his person and his work. And so one of the things that happened, I kind of watched this over the years, is that whole world, that entire world, for some reason, just completely bypassed all of the theologians. I mean, it was something I just could not figure out, right? So, and why did this happen? I think because of maybe clout chasing. It could have been, this is conjecture here, maybe there was some utilitarianism here, but I think one of the main problems is that their narrow definition of black is people from the hood. And so what they thought, which was so stupid to me, is that, well, if we get a bunch of rappers rapping Reformed doctrine, we'll get more blacks in the Reformed evangelical movement. And what black communities need is better doctrine, because they actually told them this foolishness that the traditional black church didn't have good doctrine, and that we need to plant more churches in black communities because the black church is so deficient and lacking the gospel. But again, it was this really narrow understanding of the gospel, not a robust and holistic one. And it eventually created a mess. And so what's happened as a consequence is so many of those young men and women who were card-carrying Calvinist Reformed folks are not even in evangelicalism today. Because when it came to those issues, the five-pointers, the pietists, the revivalists, had no answers. And in much of those circles, when it comes to dealing with issues in society, they've only got two answers, really. One is evangelism, and then secondly, like church planting. Maybe thirdly, I might add doctrine, right? Yeah. So church planting, we need to do some church planting. We need to get some conversions, and we need to get good gospel preaching and some good doctrine. And if we have those things, then everything else will just naturally fall in place. But here's the problem with that. There is not a single era of church history where you can make that case that just because people had a right doctrine, that they made good decisions, wise decisions, ethical decisions about how that doctrine applied to society. That just simply did not happen. Had that happened, we wouldn't have gotten Puritans who were chaplains on slave ships. We wouldn't have gotten Jonathan Edwards, who was a slave owner. We would not have had Calvinism, which was invoked to sustain and defend chattel slavery in this country. We would not have gotten both fundamentalism and later on evangelicalism, which stood on the wrong side of Jim Crow and supported it using the curse of Ham theology. That there were all these men who had great doctrine, right? Great churches, starting churches, but they were also proponents of Jim Crow, or even further back, they were defending slavery. So there is no necessary consequence that says that if you have right doctrine, you're going to apply it culturally and socially in a way that's consistent with that doctrine. And this is why, for me, people like Herman Bavinck and Reinhold Niebuhr and Gerard Van Groningen in particular were just so incredibly helpful, because they help to connect the dots and navigate between the categories of doctrine and society. And I again, my heart's just really broken over Lecrae's experience and others. They experienced a lot of church hurt. I mean, I got my own stuff as well, and I've written about that. They were just utterly maligned and condemned because they were considered to be traitors because they had walked away from doctrine and had embraced a woke theology or sort of wokeness or leftist frameworks on these issues. And that was just completely and utterly unfair. I mean, what did you expect these guys to do? They didn't have a toolbox to connect the dots because the very men who brought them in and platformed them and made them even more famous didn't give them what they needed because they lacked, I would argue, they lacked either the exposure or the humility to bring them to people like Vincent Bacote or Lance Lewis or Howard Brown. I could go down a whole list of African Americans that would have been a much, much better starting point for thinking about doctrine and life than what they got. And the principle is simply this. I'll just say this. You never want to introduce ethnic minorities in this country to any theological framework taught by men who have never had to sift through and think about social ethics. That is the worst community to introduce doctrine to because they are not going to give them the tools they need to connect those dots. People in ethnic communities, especially ethnic minorities in this country, they have to simultaneously think about issues regarding personal salvation, personal piety, but they also have to simultaneously think about how this stuff applies and matters in their neighborhoods and their families, how it applies in politics and society. And if you have the privilege of not having to ask those questions or not wrestling with those questions, you can't really help us. Or rather, I'd say you can help us a little bit, right? And that's what happened. They were given a really deficient, atrophied, I would say underdeveloped tool set that proposed to be comprehensive, and it actually was not at all. And when you get a bunch of young men who come from communities where they didn't get a lot of doctrine and they get a taste of good doctrine and they went off and really got enamored by the aura of some of these men, it makes complete sense. I'm not slagging them off. The problem for me is not Lecrae and the guys in the 116 year. That's not the problem. The problem to me are the men who brought them into a substandard theological framework. That's the problem. And had that not happened, had they had something more robust, I think it would have turned out completely differently in terms of Lecrae's story and so many other stories of young men and women who have since walked away from what's called Reformed evangelicalism. They've walked away from the gospel movement. They have walked away from evangelicalism. And it makes sense given the categories that they were delivered at the time when they first were introduced to some of these categories. So in the end, I am very convinced that if the 116 crew, if Lecrae and everyone else in that world had been introduced to this understanding of Reformed theology first, all the stuff that happened during the police shootings, all the stuff that happened when they started talking about race and culture issues would not have happened because they would have had the categories to think about it. They would have talked about the cultural mandate and the social mandate and the fellowship mandate, and they would have had the resources to connect these dots in a way that would have helped to make sense of what doctrine and theology has to do with life and society. So in the end, please, if you are in the Reformed community, or rather I should say the Calvinist community, please don't reduce the tradition to the 5 points of Calvinism, you are setting them up to leave if that's all you give them. You have to give them the entire robust tradition grounded in confessions and not grounded in personalities. They need to be grounded in the three forms of unity. They need to be grounded in the Westminster Confession of Faith. They need to be grounded in a tradition that is not dependent on the opinions and the limitations of individuals. So one of the things that Lecrae mentioned about John Piper, which is true about any of us, is that he's a man of his time and he has limitations in terms of his framework because of his own experience. This is why you don't simply use one person to frame how you think about theology and doctrine. So yeah, I use Bavinck, I use Van Groningen, but I use a whole bunch of other people as well. And that's how I'm able to do the kind of work that I do. If I just use like Tim Keller or someone, I couldn't do it. I could not just use Tim Keller alone and write a book on poverty. I could not do it. I couldn't even use John Calvin alone and talk about poverty. I am using Bavinck and Van Groningen and Niebuhr, the three of them, and some others to talk about some of these issues, because that's what we do in Christian social thought. We draw from a range of people, not just one personality, because that will introduce some limitations, because they were writing and speaking about issues that were unique to their particular time and era and context. And I honestly think that had they been given Van Groningen instead of Piper, they would have had a much broader framework to deal with the kind of issues that came up as things were changing in the culture. They would have had something to draw from. They would have had something to use as a way to make sense of it, instead of, by the way, this happens on the right and the left, just reverting back to secular political ideology and political philosophy. It was a mistake that could have been prevented had they not been given the right categories. And one of the things that Lecrae said about Piper on race is that Piper dropped the ball. And I'm saying, well, Piper didn't drop the ball. Piper didn't have a ball to drop, because his understanding of Reformed theology is so limited and so narrow that it doesn't have the raw material to deal with social questions. So it wasn't that he dropped the ball. It's that he didn't have a ball in his hand at all when it came to social questions to drop. Now, when it comes to issues of personal salvation, issues in the church, issues of piety, issues of evangelism, yeah, that content is great, right? It really helped a lot of people. So I'm not slagging it off in terms of that. What I am saying again is it's not enough, not comprehensive enough, not robust enough. And if you really want to help people in the long run, for those of you in the Reformed world, you can't just give them the 5 points of Calvinism and the solas. That is not Reformed theology at its core. And it's also not something that will help them think about the intersection of faith and life. So let me pause for just a second and say this, because I know how a lot of you all are. I'm not saying that Lecrae and the 116 Clique, like that whole crew, should have just used Van Groningen instead of John Piper. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Van Groningen represents a tradition with a much deeper resource bank than the Puritans when it comes to social issues, a deeper resource bank when it comes to issues of church and state and government and business and society and the arts. Like, there's a much deeper resource bank for those types of questions and issues than they got from the 5 pointers. The 5 pointers are just so deficient in connecting those dots, because it's just simply not in their toolkit, because it's just so pietistic. And another form is also equally overly revivalistic. And so when you wed pietism and revivalism, you don't get a lot of social issues, which is why I think in a lot of the pietistic and revivalist traditions, they turned a blind eye inadvertently to social suffering in this country by African Americans, because they were chiefly concerned, and there's an eschatology there, were just saving their souls. And I'm like, yeah, you got to save their souls, but they also don't need to be enslaved. Yeah. We need to save their souls, but they also don't need to be living under Jim Crow. God cares about slavery, and God cares a lot about Jim Crow because there are men and women made in His image who are being oppressed, and that is equally something that God cares about, because the devil is working in that particular context. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not slagging those guys off because they had one hero. I'm saying that there's a whole library of other people that would have been much better resources, beginning with people like Gerard Van Groningen and Herman Bavinck and Reinhold Niebuhr and Francis Schaeffer and a whole host of other people. Would have been much, much better to start. Okay, that's all I got. That's my little rant. Again, I'm really heartbroken for Lecrae and others. All of this could have been prevented. It was completely predictable, given the little toolbox that they got. And it's just sad because it could have gone another way had they been introduced to a different theological framework from the beginning.